Every storm brought the sound of a church bell, even though the priest had died years ago. The people of San Mercy feared the old church on the hill more than the desert itself. Then a wandering cowboy called the Rider arrived with Ghost, a black horse that sensed danger before any man could see it. A silent orphan boy kept ringing the bell each stormy night, so the town would never forget the dead. But beneath the church, the Rider uncovered a terrible secret buried for years beneath fear, guilt, and stolen land. And before the final bell stopped ringing forever, an entire town would be forced to confess the truth. Before tonight's story begins, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ride with us. The desert wind carried the smell of dry wood and distant dust long before San Mercy appeared on the horizon. The Rider sat silently atop Ghost as the black horse moved through the fading afternoon light with slow, careful steps, the animal's dark ears twitching toward sounds no human could hear. The Rider looked the same as every lonely traveler who had spent too many years surviving beneath western skies. Tall and lean, with broad shoulders hidden beneath a long, worn leather duster, weathered tan skin burned by desert wind, sharp cheekbones beneath tired gray-brown eyes, and a rough, short beard that made him look older when shadows touched his face. His dark charcoal hat cast a permanent shadow across his expressionless face, but people who watched carefully always noticed something heavy behind those eyes. Ghost carried the same quiet exhaustion. The large black American quarter horse moved with unusual caution as they approached the town, nostrils flaring against the hot wind while the faded white star on the horse's forehead caught the last weak sunlight. San Mercy looked like a town that had stopped believing in tomorrow. Most frontier towns became loud before sunset, filled with arguments, hammering, saloon music, and tired laughter from men trying to forget hard lives. But San Mercy felt hollow. Windows were already shut, even though daylight still remained. Curtains moved whenever the Rider passed, but nobody stepped outside. Several men sitting near the general store immediately lowered their eyes when the church bell tower became visible behind him. Nobody looked toward the hill. Nobody even mentioned it. The church stood above the town like something abandoned by God himself. The white paint had peeled away beneath years of desert wind. The wooden roof sagged from rot. Rust covered the old bell tower, and the crooked cross leaning over the roof looked moments away from snapping completely. Yet despite its condition, the Rider could feel people watching it from the corners of their eyes. Ghost suddenly stopped walking. The Rider lightly pulled the reins, but the horse refused to move another step toward the church road. Ghost lowered his head, sniffing the air with visible tension before letting out a low, distressed snort. The animal's muscles tightened beneath the saddle. "That horse don't like the church much," an old rancher muttered from beside a water trough. The Rider finally glanced toward him. Why should he? The old man hesitated. His beard was thin and yellowed from tobacco, and fear lived permanently in his cloudy eyes. "Bell rings at night sometimes." "Someone ringing it? No one alive?" The old man immediately regretted answering and walked away. The Rider guided Ghost toward the town's only boarding house. The horse still looked toward the church hill while they crossed the empty street. The woman running the inn introduced herself as Martha Vale. She was somewhere near 40, but looked older beneath the weak lantern light. Her face was thin and pale, with tired green eyes that carried the exhaustion of someone who had buried too many people. Dark chestnut hair, streaked with early silver, rested loosely around her shoulders, and her hands trembled slightly whenever the church hill became visible through the windows. Martha spoke softly, almost like someone afraid of waking old ghosts. "You passing through?" she asked while pouring coffee. "Usually." "You shouldn't stay long." "Why?" Martha hesitated. "Storm season's coming." The rider noticed she avoided saying the word church. Later that evening, Sheriff Dunn entered the inn. He was a large, aging man with heavy shoulders, a thick gray mustache, and cold blue eyes worn down by decades of hard choices. His black sheriff coat looked faded from years beneath desert sun, and the scarred hand resting near his revolver carried the stiffness of old injuries. Unlike most sheriffs, Dunn did not walk like a man proud of authority. He moved like someone permanently tired. His eyes immediately settled on Ghost standing outside the stable window. "That horse yours?" he asked. The rider nodded once. "Animals act strange near the hill?" The rider studied him carefully. "Mine does." Sheriff Dunn remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Stay away from the church after dark." "Why?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Because people around here stopped sleeping. Peaceful after Father Abel died." The name lingered heavily inside the room. Martha quietly lowered her eyes. The rider asked, "Priest died recently?" 3 years ago, Dunn answered. "Desert fever. But the bell still rings." Nobody spoke after that. Near sunset, the rider finally noticed the boy. Eli Ward sat alone beside the church fence high above town. He looked no older than 11, painfully thin beneath oversized, worn clothing, patched together too many times. His dark hair hung unevenly around a pale face sharpened by hunger and loneliness. But the strangest thing about him was his silence. Eli watched the church with deep brown eyes that looked far older than any child should. Ghost immediately noticed him too. The black horse slowly approached the fence despite refusing to go farther toward the church itself. Eli carefully raised one trembling hand toward the horse's nose. Ghost allowed the touch without hesitation. That alone unsettled the rider. Ghost trusted very few people. Eli smiled faintly before quickly looking away again. "You live here?" the rider asked. The boy nodded once. "Family." Eli's silence answered enough. Martha later explained the rest. "Boy can't speak. Lost his parents years ago during the drought. Father Abel found him wandering outside town nearly dead." "Who takes care of him now?" Martha looked uncomfortable. "People help when they can." But the rider understood what she truly meant. Nobody really did. That night, the wind changed. The storm arrived slowly at first, carrying sheets of dust across the empty streets, while shutters slammed shut throughout San Mercy. Ghost became restless long before midnight. The black horse paced violently inside the stable, ears pinned backward while sniffing the air again and again. Then the bell rang. One deep metallic sound rolled across the town, then another. The rider woke instantly. Ghost was already awake, stomping hard against the stable floor. The rider stepped outside into the storm. Sand cut through the darkness like smoke. The bell continued ringing through the wind above town. Most houses remained dark. Nobody came outside, because everyone in San Mercy had already heard it before. The rider climbed the hill slowly with Ghost following close behind. But halfway toward the church steps, the horse suddenly stopped. Ghost slammed both front hooves into the dirt and let out a sharp, distressed whinny. The rider narrowed his eyes. The horse physically moved sideways, blocking the church entrance, like something inside disturbed him. For several seconds, neither moved. Then lightning flashed behind the bell tower, and the rider saw Eli. The small boy stood completely alone before the dark church doors while the bell echoed overhead through the storm, not frightened, not surprised, just watching the church in silence. The rider took another slow step forward. Ghost immediately blocked him again. The black horse's muscles shook beneath the rain and dust. The rider finally listened. Something about the church felt wrong, not haunted, worse, human. The bell suddenly stopped. Silence swallowed the hill. Eli disappeared into the darkness moments later, without saying a word. By morning, the storm had passed. The town looked pale and exhausted beneath weak sunrise light. The rider climbed the church hill again while Ghost waited farther back near the fence line, still unwilling to approach the entrance. Then the rider noticed them, fresh footprints beneath the bell tower. Not old, not buried by dust. Someone had stood there recently, and someone had walked back down before dawn. Morning arrived cold and pale over San Mercy, but the town still carried the silence of the previous night, like a sickness nobody wanted to name aloud. Dust moved slowly through the empty streets while weak sunlight touched the crooked church on the hill above town. The rider stood beside the fresh footprints beneath the bell tower for several long moments, studying the marks in the dirt. The tracks were small and narrow, not the boots of a grown rancher, not heavy enough for Sheriff Dunn. Someone light had climbed the hill during the storm after midnight and left before dawn. Ghost refused to come closer. The large black horse stood 20 yards away, near the old fence line, muscles tense beneath the worn saddle. The faded white star on the horse's forehead caught the morning light as Ghost kept staring toward the tower without blinking. Every few seconds the horse sniffed the air again, then shifted uneasily as though something inside the church disturbed him in ways he could not explain. The rider finally climbed the church steps alone. The doors groaned softly when he pushed them open. Dust floated through thin shafts of light leaking from broken stained glass windows overhead. The church smelled of dry wood, old wax, and years of abandonment. Yet something felt wrong immediately. Someone had been here recently. Near the altar, melted candle wax still looked fresh. A small prayer candle continued releasing a thin trail of smoke, as if it had only just gone out minutes earlier. The rider crouched beside it silently. Then he noticed footprints inside the dust, small again. A child. The rider slowly scanned the room until his eyes settled on the back hallway leading beneath the church. The old wine cellar door stood slightly open. Downstairs, the air turned colder. Rows of broken shelves filled the underground room, but hidden behind stacked crates rested wrapped food supplies, old blankets, and 2 small water barrels recently filled. Somebody had been surviving beneath the church. The rider touched the cloth covering one loaf of bread. Still soft, Ghost suddenly snorted loudly outside. The rider heard the horse paw violently against dirt above ground. Then came the sound of running footsteps. When he stepped back outside, Eli Ward stood frozen near the fence. The boy looked terrified. His thin body trembled beneath an oversized brown sweater, patched too many times to count. Dark, tangled hair covered part of his pale face, but his eyes carried something heavier than fear. Guilt, like a child carrying secrets too large for his own life. The rider walked toward him slowly. "You been inside the church?" Eli hesitated, then nodded once. "Those footprints yours?" Another nod. The rider did not sound angry. "You living in there?" Eli quickly shook his head. The boy pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket with shaking fingers and wrote carefully across one page before handing it over. "Father Abel said the church should never stay empty." The rider looked up again. "Why?" Eli stared toward the church tower before writing another sentence. "Because people forget fast." The rider studied the child more carefully now. Eli did not speak like someone inventing ghost stories. He carried the strange seriousness of children forced to survive too early. Before the rider could ask more questions, Ghost suddenly lifted his head sharply toward town. Sheriff Dunn was approaching. The old sheriff climbed the hill slowly beneath the rising wind. His heavy black coat dragged dust behind him, while his weathered face looked even older in daylight. Deep lines surrounded his cold blue eyes, and exhaustion seemed permanently carved into his expression. His gaze immediately fell toward the open church doors. "You start digging in dead places, Dunn muttered. Eventually something ugly crawls out. The rider leaned against the railing calmly. Church ain't dead. The sheriff's jaw tightened. You staying long enough to learn how this town works? Maybe. That'd be a mistake. Ghost suddenly pinned his ears back and stepped sideways as Dunn passed closer to the church steps. The horse's reaction lasted only a second, but the rider noticed. Animals rarely lied. Dunn looked toward the tower without hiding his discomfort. Father Abel wanted people confessing things better left buried. What things? The sheriff remained silent long enough for wind to fill the space between them. Then finally, some things buried in desert towns stay buried for a reason. The rider watched him carefully. You believe that? Dunn's eyes looked briefly toward the empty streets below. I believe fear keeps towns alive longer than truth does. Then the sheriff turned and walked back downhill without another word. Eli remained standing beside the fence, staring after him. Later that afternoon, the storm winds returned. The rider spent hours exploring the church grounds, while Ghost followed uneasily from distance. The horse continued refusing to stand beneath the bell tower itself. Instead, Ghost repeatedly circled behind the church, near an old stone well partially buried by sand. Each time the rider approached the well, Ghost became visibly nervous. By sunset, the horse stood beside it again, staring downward. The rider brushed sand aside from the crumbling stone edge. The well looked abandoned for years. The rope pulley had rotted away completely, and part of the ground surrounding it sagged unnaturally beneath the dirt. Then Ghost suddenly jerked backward hard. The horse slammed one hoof into the ground and let out a sharp, distressed whinny. At the same moment, the earth beneath the rider cracked. He barely stumbled backward before half the dirt around the well collapsed into darkness with a violent roar. Dust exploded upward into the evening air. The rider stared silently at the hole, now gaping beside him. If Ghost had reacted 1 second later, he would have fallen directly through. For several moments neither moved. Then the rider noticed something beneath the collapsed dirt. Wood. A doorway. Old iron hinges barely visible beneath years of buried sand. Ghost kept staring toward the darkness below with trembling muscles, refusing to step closer. The rider crouched beside the opening carefully. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the smell of damp stone and old decay. Whatever lay beneath the church had remained hidden for a very long time. Night fell quickly after that. Martha Vale served dinner quietly inside the inn, while wind battered the windows outside. Tonight she looked even more exhausted than before. Loose strands of silver-streaked chestnut hair fell around her pale face, while dark circles beneath her eyes revealed years without proper sleep. You found something, she said softly. The rider glanced toward her. You can tell. People only get that look after the church scares them. The rider studied her carefully. You knew Father Abel well? Martha stopped cleaning one glass. He was the only man in town who still believed people could become better. What happened to him? Pain crossed her face instantly. He got sick. But that ain't the whole answer. Martha looked away toward the storm outside. No, she whispered, it ain't. That night the wind grew violent again. Near midnight, Ghost woke first. The black horse stomped hard inside the stable, while staring toward the church hill through blowing sand. Then the rider heard it, soft praying, a human voice, low and distant beneath the storm. The rider followed the sound uphill with Ghost close behind. But the horse slowed again near the church doors, visibly uneasy. Inside the dark church, the whispering continued somewhere near the altar, a prayer, broken and trembling. The rider stepped slowly through the darkness. Empty pews, broken windows, no movement. The praying suddenly stopped. Silence swallowed the room. Then, above him, The bell rope swayed gently, creak, creak, moving on its own. Ghost let out another distressed snort behind him. The rider's eyes slowly lifted toward the ceiling tower, lost in darkness overhead. No one was there. At least, no one he could see. When he finally stepped back outside, the storm had nearly covered the ground again with drifting sand. But near the collapsed well behind the church, one thing remained visible beneath moonlight: the buried wooden door. Waiting beneath the earth, the storm finally weakened near dawn, leaving San Mercy buried beneath silence and layers of drifting sand. The rider stood beside the collapsed ground behind the church while cold desert wind moved through the broken bell tower above him. The hidden wooden door remained half buried beneath dirt and shattered stone, old iron hinges exposed for the first time in years. Ghost refused to step closer. The tall black horse stood several yards away near the church fence, with tense muscles beneath the worn saddle. Dark eyes fixed on the opening as if the animal could smell the weight of whatever had been hidden below. The rider grabbed an old lantern from the church storage room and returned to the buried doorway before sunrise fully reached the hill. Eli waited nearby in silence, his thin body wrapped in the oversized brown sweater Martha had repaired too many times. The boy's pale face looked even smaller beneath the cold morning wind. He never asked questions anymore. He simply watched the rider with the exhausted patience of a child already used to disappointment. The wooden door resisted at first. Then the rusted lock finally broke apart beneath the rider's shoulder. A narrow staircase disappeared underground into darkness. The smell rising from below carried dust, damp stone, mold, and something older, forgotten. Ghost immediately snorted hard and pawed the dirt. The rider glanced toward the horse. "You stay here." Ghost did not relax. The rider descended carefully with the lantern, while Eli followed several steps behind, despite visible fear in the boy's eyes. The underground chamber beneath the church stretched farther than expected. Stone walls lined with old wooden shelves disappeared into shadows, while thick dust covered nearly everything inside. But unlike the abandoned church above, this place had once been organized carefully: records, boxes, names, secrets. The rider slowly opened the first crate he found. Inside rested stacks of weathered papers tied together with fading cloth strings. Land deeds, water agreements, debt records. Several pages carried the official seal of San Mercy from nearly 15 years earlier. Eli stared quietly while the rider unfolded another document, then another, and slowly the truth began taking shape. Years before, San Mercy had nearly died. A brutal drought had emptied rivers, poisoned wells, and killed livestock across the region. Most towns disappeared entirely during those years, but San Mercy survived because one underground water source remained beneath the western ridge outside town. The problem was who owned the land. Immigrant families, poor laborers, travelers nobody important cared about. The rider continued reading in silence while dust drifted through lantern light. Several documents showed forced purchases far below value. Others carried signatures that looked frightened or incomplete. A few pages were stained with water damage and something darker, blood. Eli suddenly pointed toward another shelf. The rider carried the lantern closer. Letters, dozens of them, handwritten confessions. Some were short and shaky. "We should have helped them," others longer. "God forgive me for what we did beyond the western ridge." The rider's expression hardened as he realized the truth. The wealthy ranch owners of San Mercy had stolen the land surrounding the water source during the drought. Families who resisted were driven into the desert. Some disappeared completely, and Father Abel had discovered everything. Ghost suddenly let out a sharp, distressed whinny above ground. The sound echoed faintly through the stone ceiling. The rider froze. Then came another noise, movement upstairs. He quickly extinguished the lantern. For several long seconds, only silence filled the underground room. Then footsteps crossed the church floor above them, heavy, slow. A man. Eli's breathing became shallow beside him. The footsteps paused directly above the hidden staircase, then finally moved away again. The rider waited nearly a full minute before relighting the lantern. When they climbed back upstairs, Sheriff Dunn stood near the altar. The old lawman looked exhausted beyond words this morning. His heavy shoulders sagged beneath the dusty black sheriff coat, while deep shadows rested beneath cold blue eyes that no longer looked entirely hard. The moment he saw dirt on the rider's hands, something changed in his expression. Not surprise, recognition. "You found it," Dunn said, quietly. The rider studied him carefully. "You knew it was there." The sheriff remained silent. Ghost pinned both ears backward as Dunn approached the church aisle. The horse's body tensed instantly again. Dunn noticed. "Horse still don't trust me much." "Animals usually know why," the rider answered. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sheriff Dunn slowly removed his hat. The gesture alone aged him 10 years. When the drought came, he finally said, "People started dying fast. Children first, then old folks, then everybody else." His voice sounded hollow. The ranchers said the town needed the water to survive. They convinced themselves they were saving San Mercy. "And the families on the ridge?" the rider asked. Dunn looked toward the church floor. "Most got forced out." "Most?" The sheriff closed his eyes briefly. "Some never made it far enough." Eli stood completely still beside the pews. The rider noticed the boy trembling. "Father Abel found out," Dunn continued. "He wanted every name confessed publicly, said no town built on stolen graves could survive forever." "But you stopped him." The sheriff's jaw tightened painfully. "I thought if the truth came out, the town would destroy itself. And instead," Dunn looked around the ruined church slowly. "Instead, people stopped praying." Silence filled the room after that. Not angry silence, a shamed silence. Outside, wind moved softly through the broken bell tower above them. Later that afternoon, the rider continued searching the underground chamber alone, while Eli remained upstairs near Ghost. The black horse had become strangely protective of the boy now. Whenever Eli moved too close to unstable parts of the church floor, Ghost gently blocked him with his body. Once, when Eli nearly stepped near a cracked beam, the horse grabbed the back of the boy's sweater lightly with his teeth and pulled him away. The rider noticed. Ghost trusted very few people that deeply. Inside the underground chamber, new details continued appearing. Lists of missing families, burial records with false causes of death, receipts signed by wealthy ranchers, and finally, a small photograph. The rider brushed dirt carefully from the image. A younger Father Abel stood beside several immigrant families near the western ridge. Beside him rested a little boy, no older than 4, Eli. The rider stared at the photograph quietly. Then he understood. Eli's parents had not abandoned him. They had vanished during the drought years, and Father Abel had tried protecting what remained. Suddenly, Ghost exploded into movement above ground. The violent sound of hooves echoed through the church floor. The rider grabbed the lantern instantly and rushed toward the staircase. Ghost was already charging through the underground darkness when the rider reached the bottom chamber. The black horse had somehow forced his way partly through the broken stair entrance despite hating the church itself. The animal's ears pinned backward violently while Ghost moved deeper into shadows no human had searched yet. "Ghost!" The horse ignored him. Dust rose behind powerful hooves as Ghost stopped before the farthest stone wall in the chamber. The black horse slammed one hoof against the dirt floor repeatedly. The rider lifted the lantern higher. There, a second door, smaller, hidden almost completely behind collapsed shelves. But unlike the buried entrance above, this one had been locked from the outside for years. The rider slowly broke the old chain. The hinges screamed when the door opened inward. A wave of stale air escaped the darkness beyond. Then the lantern light revealed black cloth hanging against the wall. The rider stepped closer carefully. A priest's robe, old, dust-covered, and stained dark red across the chest. Blood. Father Abel's blood. The underground room fell silent except for the weak sound of wind above the church. Ghost lowered his head slowly beside the doorway. Not afraid now. Sad. The rumors spread through San Mercy faster than dust before a storm. By the next morning, nobody walked near the church hill unless absolutely necessary. Store owners shut their doors before sunset. Lanterns disappeared from windows earlier each evening. Even the saloon had grown quieter, filled now with whispers instead of arguments. People no longer spoke openly about Father Abel, yet somehow his name had returned to every conversation in town. Some claimed they had seen movement inside the church after midnight. Others swore the dead priest was walking the hill during storms. But most terrifying of all to the people of San Mercy was the possibility that the truth buried beneath the church was finally rising back into daylight. The rider noticed fear changing the town slowly. Fear made people suspicious. Hard eyes followed neighbors through the streets. Old friendships became tense silences. Several ranchers who once laughed loudly outside the general store now barely spoke at all whenever the church bell echoed across town. And every time the wind picked up after dark, the bell rang again. Ghost sensed the fear growing long before the people admitted it aloud. The tall black horse stayed unusually close to Eli now, often refusing to leave the boy's side whenever storms approached. More than once the rider woke during the night to find Ghost standing beside the church fence while Eli sat silently nearby watching the bell tower beneath drifting sand. The horse no longer looked afraid of the church itself, only of what people might do because of it. 3 nights after discovering the hidden records, the rider finally followed Eli in secret after sunset. Wind moved heavily through San Mercy while dark clouds rolled across the desert sky. The boy slipped quietly through the empty streets, carrying a small lantern hidden beneath his oversized coat. His thin frame looked almost ghost-like against the rising dust storm. Ghost followed immediately. The rider stayed farther behind. Eli climbed the church hill alone and disappeared through the broken front doors. Moments later, the old bell began to ring again through the storm, one deep, hollow sound after another. The rider stepped inside carefully, and there he saw the truth. Eli stood beneath the bell rope with both trembling hands wrapped around it while wind howled through broken stained glass windows above. Dust swirled through the church like smoke around the small, silent child. Each pull of the rope looked painfully difficult for his thin body, yet the boy continued pulling with desperate determination. Ghost stood beside him calmly. The black horse lowered his head near the boy's shoulder every time the bell rang, almost like comfort. The rider finally spoke softly. "You're the one ringing it." Eli froze. Fear crossed his pale face instantly, not fear for himself. Fear that the bell might stop forever. The boy slowly reached into his pocket and removed the same small notebook he always carried. His fingers shook badly while writing beneath lantern light. "If the bell stops, people forget." The rider read the words in silence. Eli wrote again. "Father Abel said memory is the only grave some people ever get." Outside, thunder rolled across the desert. The rider looked toward the broken altar while Eli continued writing. "He found me in the desert when I was little. Everybody else left." The boy paused before finishing the sentence. "He told me never let them forget." The rider studied Eli carefully now. The child's face carried no anger, no hatred, only grief too old for someone his age. Eli had become the final witness to people nobody else wanted to remember. Ghost suddenly nudged Eli gently with his nose. The boy rested one hand against the horse's forehead, and for a brief moment the rider realized why Ghost trusted him so deeply. Both carried loneliness in the same quiet way. The storm outside grew violent after midnight. Wind slammed against the church walls while dust hissed through cracks in the wood. The bell continued echoing through San Mercy beneath the dark sky, and somewhere below town, frightened people listened from behind locked doors. The next morning, Sheriff Dunn arrived at the church before sunrise. The old sheriff looked worse than ever now. His gray mustache had gone uneven from sleepless nights, and his heavy eyes looked permanently hollow. He climbed the church steps slowly like a man walking toward judgment. "You found the bell ringer," he said quietly. The rider nodded once. Dunn looked toward Eli sitting silently near the altar. "Kid should have left this place years ago. He stayed because nobody else did." The sheriff lowered his eyes. For several seconds, only the sound of wind filled the church. Then Dunn finally spoke again. "Father Abel kept telling people confession saves souls, but confession destroys towns." The rider leaned against one pew. "Maybe towns built on lies deserve destroying." Dunn stared at the floorboards beneath his boots. "You ever watch people die from thirst?" The question carried real pain. "When the drought came," the sheriff continued, "folks stopped acting human. Good men became desperate. Desperate men became cruel. And you?" The old sheriff's voice nearly broke. "I became useful." Silence followed again. Not angry silence this time. The silence of a man beginning to hate the person he once became. That afternoon, the rider rode with Ghost beyond the western ridge, where the missing families once lived. Eli followed behind on foot despite the distance. The desert there felt emptier than anywhere near San Mercy. Broken fence posts disappeared beneath sand dunes, while abandoned foundations barely remained visible among dead brush. Ghost moved slowly through the area with unusual caution. Then the horse suddenly stopped. The rider followed Ghost's gaze downhill, toward several fresh horse tracks leading back toward town. Not sheriff tracks, not ranch workers, armed riders. The wind carried faint smoke soon after. Ghost immediately became tense. The horse pinned his ears backward and let out a sharp warning snort before turning toward the church hill. The rider understood instantly. "Eli," he said sharply, "back to town." By the time they returned, smoke already rose near the church. Several wealthy ranch owners stood outside the hill, carrying lanterns and fuel cans. Their faces looked hard and frightened beneath blowing dust. One of them stepped forward immediately when the rider approached. Caleb Mercer, a broad, middle-aged rancher with thick arms, sunburned skin, trimmed black beard, and cruel, restless eyes sharpened by years of power. Mercer dressed better than most men in San Mercy, but fear now lived openly across his face. "That church needs burning," Mercer shouted over the wind, "before somebody tears this town apart with old lies." Several others agreed behind him. Ghost instantly reacted. The black horse exploded forward with violent force, rearing hard between Eli and the approaching ranchers. Dust erupted beneath pounding hooves, while Ghost let out a fierce, distressed scream unlike anything the rider had heard before. The horse's eyes locked directly onto Mercer, as though sensing danger deeper than weapons. The ranchers backed away instinctively. Even armed men feared a horse that angry. Eli grabbed Ghost's reins tightly, shaking with fear. The rider stepped forward slowly. "You burn that church. Truth still stays." Mercer's expression hardened. "Truth don't feed towns." "No," the rider answered quietly, "but guilt poisons them." Nobody moved after that. Wind screamed through the bell tower overhead. Then Martha Vale suddenly appeared climbing the hill. Her pale face looked terrified beneath drifting sand, and loose silver-streaked hair whipped violently around exhausted green eyes. She stared toward the church for several seconds before finally looking at the rider. "There's something you still don't know," she whispered. The wind briefly softened. Martha's voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Father Abel didn't die only from the fever." Silence swallowed the hill. Even the bells stopped moving. The wind began screaming across San Mercy long before nightfall, dragging walls of sand through the empty streets while dark clouds swallowed the fading sun. By evening, the entire town felt trapped beneath the weight of something inevitable. Doors were barred shut. Lanterns disappeared behind curtains. Even the saloon had gone silent. People no longer drank to forget. They waited. And above them all, the old church stood against the storm like a dying witness, refusing to fall. Martha Vale sat beside the church altar with both hands trembling around a cold coffee cup, while Eli slept nearby beneath a blanket Ghost had refused to leave. The black horse stood near the broken doorway, watching the storm outside with restless eyes, every muscle tight beneath the old leather saddle. Dust gathered across the horse's dark coat, while thunder rolled far beyond the western ridge. The rider stood beside Martha beneath weak lantern light. His weathered face remained unreadable beneath the shadow of his charcoal hat, but his tired gray-brown eyes never left her expression. "You said Father Abel didn't die only from fever," he said quietly. Martha lowered her gaze toward the floorboards. For several moments she could not answer. Then finally, "The fever was real. He was already dying." Her voice cracked badly, but somebody made sure he wouldn't recover. The rider remained silent. Martha wiped one shaking hand across her mouth before continuing. 3 years ago, Father Abel planned to speak during Sunday service. He wanted every name read aloud. Every family buried outside town, every ranch owner who helped steal the water. The storm outside rattled the stained glass remains overhead. He told them God couldn't forgive a town built on hidden graves. "And what happened?" the rider asked. Martha's tired green eyes filled with pain. "The next morning he was dead." Ghost suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the entrance. The horse let out a low, warning snort. Someone was outside. Sheriff Dunn stepped through the church doors moments later, carrying sand across the floor with him. The old lawman looked like a man who had not slept in years. His black sheriff coat hung heavily from tired shoulders, while deep lines beneath cold blue eyes made him look almost ghost-like beneath the lantern glow. Dunn removed his hat slowly when he saw Martha. "She told you?" The rider nodded once. The sheriff stared toward the broken altar. "I didn't poison him." "But you covered it up," Martha whispered. Dunn closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." The confession landed heavily inside the church. Not dramatic, just exhausted, like a man finally too tired to keep lying. "They said the town would collapse if the truth got out," Dunn continued. "People would leave. Ranches would burn. Families would kill each other over the water." "And what did you believe?" the rider asked. The sheriff's voice became hollow. "I believed fear was cheaper than justice." Silence filled the church after that. Even the storm outside seemed quieter for a moment. Then Ghost suddenly exploded into motion. The black horse slammed both front hooves against the floor and let out a violent, distressed scream while turning sharply toward the western windows. Smoke. The rider smelled it immediately. Fire. Outside, orange light flickered through blowing sand near the church hill. A group of riders emerged through the storm carrying lanterns and rifles. Caleb Mercer rode at the front. The broad ranch owner's face looked twisted by panic now. dark beard wet with sand and sweat, while fear burned openly inside cruel, restless eyes. "They're gonna burn it," Martha shouted. The rider moved instantly. Ghost was already faster. The black horse charged through the church doors before anyone else reached the steps, hooves pounding against wood while wind screamed through the bell tower overhead. Eli woke suddenly in terror as the storm swallowed the hill. Outside, several ranchmen had already begun pouring oil near the church walls. "Stop!" Sheriff Dunn roared, but nobody listened anymore. Fear had gone too far. One lantern crashed against the side of the church. Flames erupted instantly. Dry wood exploded beneath years of desert heat and rot. Within seconds, fire climbed across the walls, while townspeople began appearing below the hill, watching through the storm with terrified faces. Some looked horrified, others looked relieved, like people desperate to destroy the truth before it destroyed them first. Then part of the roof cracked overhead. Ghost reacted before anyone else. The horse lunged sideways and grabbed Eli's coat hard between his teeth, violently pulling the boy backward seconds before burning beams collapsed onto the church floor where Eli had stood. Wood shattered across the aisle in a wave of sparks. Eli fell hard against Ghost's shoulder, shaking violently. The rider stared at the horse for one brief second. Ghost had saved the boy again. Then chaos swallowed everything. Fire spread rapidly across the church roof, while smoke poured into the storm-dark sky above San Mercy. Ranchers shouted, townspeople screamed, horses panicked against reins, and through it all, the bell remained silent. The rider suddenly realized what everyone was truly afraid of. Not ghosts, not Father Abel, confession. He climbed the burning bell tower stairs before anyone could stop him. "Rider!" Dunn shouted. The rider ignored him. Heat slammed against his face as flames crawled across the walls around him. Smoke thickened with every step upward, while old wood groaned beneath his boots. Below, the entire town watched. Then the rider grabbed the bell rope and rang it. One massive metallic sound exploded through the storm. The entire hill froze. Again. The bell echoed across San Mercy louder than it ever had before. Again. The sound rolled through every street, every ranch house, every locked door, carrying the weight of years nobody wanted to remember. Something changed in the crowd below. An old woman began crying openly. A ranch hand dropped his rifle into the dirt. Another man whispered, "We should have helped them." Then another voice answered from somewhere in the storm, "My brother buried bodies near the ridge." The confessions began slowly at first. Broken, ashamed, human, Sheriff Dunn stood motionless beneath the burning church, while townspeople around him finally spoke aloud the guilt they had carried for years. And Ghost stood directly before Eli the entire time. The black horse refused to move even as sparks rained through the storm around them. Ears pinned backward, muscles trembling, Ghost physically blocked several panicked men from reaching the church doors while Eli hid behind him. The rider finally descended from the tower, coughing through smoke. The church roof was beginning to collapse. "We need the records!" Martha shouted. Nobody moved, nobody except Sheriff Dunn. The old sheriff looked toward the flames, swallowing the sanctuary around them. Then slowly, he removed his gun belt and handed it to the rider. "I helped bury the truth once," he said quietly. His tired blue eyes settled on the burning church. "Ain't doing it twice." Then Sheriff Dunn turned and walked directly into the flames, toward the hidden chamber beneath the church, toward the confessions, toward judgment. Dawn arrived slowly over San Mercy, like forgiveness struggling to reach a wounded place. Smoke drifted through the pale yellow morning sky, while the remains of the burned church still crackled softly above the silent town. Half the roof had collapsed during the night. The old bell tower leaned dangerously now, blackened by fire and scarred by years of wind, but somehow the bell itself still remained hanging above the ruins. For the first time in years, it did not ring. The rider stood near the church hill, watching exhausted townspeople move carefully through ash and broken wood. His tall, lean silhouette remained motionless beneath the worn leather duster, while weak sunrise light touched the weathered lines across his face. Dust clung to the dark charcoal hat, shadowing his cold, gray-brown eyes, but the heaviness inside those eyes looked different now. Not lighter, just quieter. Beside him, Ghost stood completely calm. The tall, black horse no longer stared nervously toward the church. The animal's ears rested naturally for the first time since arriving in San Mercy, and the horse's breathing remained steady, despite the smoke still hanging in the wind. The faded white star on Ghost's forehead caught the weak dawn light while Eli sat silently beside him against the church fence. The boy looked exhausted beyond words. Ash stained his oversized sweater, and dark circles rested beneath young brown eyes that had not truly slept in years. Yet for the first time since the rider met him, Eli no longer watched the bell tower constantly, like something inside him had finally stopped waiting. Several men carried Sheriff Dunn from the church ruins shortly after sunrise. The old sheriff was alive, barely. His arms and face were wrapped in burned cloth, while smoke damage left his breathing rough and uneven. But even injured, Dunn still looked strangely calmer than before. The guilt that had hollowed him for years no longer hid behind silence now. The town finally knew what he had helped bury. Martha Vale walked beside the stretcher carrying a basin of water and clean cloth. Her pale, exhausted face looked worn by grief, but there was strength returning to her now, too. Loose, silver-streaked chestnut hair moved softly in the morning wind, while tired green eyes watched over the injured sheriff without bitterness. Dunn motioned weakly toward the rider as he passed. "I saved some," he rasped painfully. The rider understood immediately. The records. Hours later, several smoke-blackened confession books and land documents rested across the old inn tables beneath careful hands. Townspeople gathered around them in heavy silence, while names once hidden finally became impossible to ignore. Widows learned where husbands had been buried. Families discovered who had stolen their land. Old ranch workers admitted what they helped do during the drought years. And slowly, painfully, San Mercy began facing itself. Not everybody accepted the truth easily. Caleb Mercer refused at first. The broad ranch owner stood in the middle of town shouting that the church fire had poisoned people's minds. His dark beard looked rough and uneven after the storm, while restless, angry eyes searched desperately for control, slipping away from him. But this morning fewer people listened. Fear no longer ruled the town the way it once had, especially after several older ranch hands stepped forward publicly. One by one, they admitted helping drive immigrant families away from the Western Ridge years earlier. One old stable worker even confessed where shallow graves had been left beneath the desert sand during the drought. The silence afterward felt heavier than any storm, yet somehow cleaner too. By afternoon, men rode west carrying shovels instead of rifles. The rider and Ghost followed them beyond the ridge, while Eli rode quietly behind Martha in an old wagon. Wind moved gently across the desert now, soft enough to reveal pieces of buried history beneath drifting sand, broken markers, old fence lines, forgotten graves. Ghost walked carefully among them without fear. The horse lowered his head near one shallow grave beneath a dead mesquite tree and remained still for several long seconds. Eli slowly climbed down from the wagon and stood beside Ghost quietly. Then the boy placed one small stone near the grave marker. Soon others did the same. No speeches followed. No prayers at first. Only silence. But for the first time in many years, the dead of San Mercy were no longer hidden. That night, Martha reopened the church doors. or what remained of them. The burned sanctuary smelled of ash and wet wood, while moonlight poured through the collapsed roof overhead. Several pews remained standing despite the fire, and someone had carefully placed Father Abel's surviving cross near the altar ruins. No priest came, no sermon waited. Still people entered quietly. Some sat in silence. Some cried openly. Some finally prayed again. The rider remained near the back wall beside Ghost, while Eli walked slowly toward the old bell rope, hanging blackened from fire damage. For a moment the rider thought the boy might ring it again. Instead, Eli simply touched the rope gently with one hand, then let it go. The bell remained silent above them. Ghost walked forward quietly and rested his head against Eli's shoulder. The boy closed his eyes. No fear remained inside his face now, only exhaustion and relief. Later that evening, Eli sat beside the rider outside the ruined church, while weak lantern light flickered behind them. The desert night had grown calm again, no storm winds, no screaming bell, only crickets and distant horses. Eli wrote carefully inside his notebook before handing it over. "Do you think God ever leaves a town?" The rider stared toward the burned church for a long moment before answering. "People leave God long before God leaves them." Eli read the sentence twice, then slowly nodded, like a child finally understanding something he had carried too long alone. The next morning, San Mercy looked different beneath sunrise light. Workers rebuilt fences near the western ridge. Several ranch owners signed papers returning stolen land to surviving families. New grave markers appeared beyond town, and for the first time in years, the church hill no longer felt haunted. Before leaving, Martha approached the rider carrying something wrapped carefully in cloth. Inside rested a burned piece of the old bell rope. "Eli wanted you to have it," she said softly. The rider studied the blackened rope silently. Smoke still lingered faintly inside the fibers. A reminder, not of ghosts, of truth. He tied the burned rope carefully beside the old saddle of Ghost. Near, the seed pouch from Dry Creek, the silver fragment from Black Hollow, the cowbell from Red Hollow. Ghost stood perfectly still while the rope tapped softly against worn leather in the morning breeze. Eli approached quietly afterward. The boy looked smaller now, without fear hardening his face. Just a lonely child again, standing beneath sunlight, but no longer alone. Ghost lowered his head beside him one final time. Eli smiled faintly and touched the horse's forehead where the faded white star rested. Then the rider climbed into the saddle. No dramatic farewell followed. San Mercy had already said enough. The rider guided Ghost slowly toward the open desert, while pale gold sunlight spread across the sand behind them. The burned bell rope knocked gently against the saddle with every step. Wind carried the faint sound across the empty trail as the ruined church disappeared farther into the distance. Behind them, San Mercy woke beneath silence for the first time in years. And above the blackened church tower, the bell never rang again. Sometimes the greatest miracle God gives a town is not a voice from heaven, but the courage to finally tell the truth. In San Mercy, the bell did not stop because the ghosts disappeared. It stopped because people finally faced the sins they had buried for years. And maybe that is true in our own lives too. Some wounds stay open not because God abandoned us, but because fear keeps us from confessing, forgiving, and healing. The rider learned that faith is not about pretending darkness never existed. Faith is choosing to walk toward the light anyway, even after the fire, even after the guilt, even after the loss. If this story touched your heart, share where you are watching from and tell us what part stayed with you the most. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to ride with us into the next journey. May God watch over you, protect your family, and guide your road home wherever life takes you.